The screech of tires echoed through the stormy night, as a mechanic's simple act of kindness would unknowingly pull him into a world of billion-dollar secrets and betrayal. Sophie Montgomery was no ordinary woman. Her true identity was a dangerous game. And Tom? He was about to discover that sometimes the biggest fortunes hide the darkest truths. What happens when the rich seek revenge, and he's caught in the middle? The rain came down in thick sheets, painting the road with silver streaks under the glow of the streetlights. Tom Heiress squinted through his windshield, his truck's wipers working overtime, clearing the glass in rhythmic swipes. He was nearly home, just another long day at the shop behind him, another shift spent fixing cars that barely ran, in a garage that barely paid the bills. The familiar hum of his truck's engine was the only sound, comforting and constant. But tonight, it was different. The road ahead, normally empty at this hour, had a car stopped by the side, hazard lights blinking in the dark. Tom didn't think twice. He'd always been the kind of guy who helped, no matter how late it was. Pulling up beside the car, he could barely make out a figure standing by the flat tire, hair plastered to her face in the pouring rain. It wasn't until he stopped, rolled down his window, and called out that he realized how out of place she looked. "Hey, you need help with that?" His voice was rough, like gravel, but friendly enough. The woman turned, and for a moment, Tom felt his heart skip. She was young, maybe mid-20s, and dressed in a coat that looked far too fancy for this part of town. Her eyes, wide and dark, met his with a flash of something almost desperate. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, I'm stuck," she said, her voice strained from the cold and frustration. She brushed the wet strands of hair away from her face, but it was clear she wasn't used to being in this situation. Tom stepped out of his truck, his boots splashing in the growing puddles. He could feel the weight of the rain on his shoulders, but he didn't mind. This was the part of his life. He didn't mind the helping part, the dirty, honest part. "I can fix that for you. You don't look like you're from around here," he said, squinting at her car. It was sleek, shiny, far fancier than anything he'd ever driven. He could almost see his own reflection in the black paint, rough and worn. She hesitated for a beat. "I'm not. I'm just passing through." "Ah, I see. Well, we'll have you on your way in no time." Tom bent down to inspect the tire. "Name's Tom." "Sophie," she replied softly, her breath visible in the cold air. "I really appreciate this. I don't even know how to change a tire." "Not a problem," he said with a slight chuckle, his hands already working on loosening the lug nuts. "Not everyone's got the time to learn how to do it. I don't mind helping." Sophie watched him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest to keep warm. She looked out of place, like she didn't belong here in the rain-soaked street in front of Tom's shop, the same street where every other person seemed to know exactly how their life was supposed to go. Tom's hands moved quickly, the familiar rhythm of fixing a car almost meditative for him. But there was something about Sophie that caught his attention, something different. The way she stood, just a little too stiff, like she didn't quite know how to stand in a place like this. Or maybe it was the slight tremor in her voice when she spoke, like she was trying to keep a secret, even if she didn't know why. "You sure you're okay?" Tom asked, glancing up as he worked. He saw the way her eyes flickered around nervously, like she was trying to make sure no one saw her. "Yeah, I'm fine," Sophie said quickly, though there was a crack in her voice. She shifted on her feet, the weight of something unsaid hanging between them. Just not used to things like this happening. Tom nodded. He didn't need to press her. He'd seen enough people in his shop to know when someone was trying to hide something. The rain, the night, there was something about it all that felt a little off. But for now, all he could do was focus on fixing her car. He didn't have time for anything else. Not tonight. It wasn't until the tire was changed and Tom stepped back to admire his work that Sophie spoke again. "Thank you." "Really?" she said, the rain still running down her cheeks as she smiled at him, her expression warmer now. "You really didn't have to." Tom wiped his hands on a rag, shaking his head. "It's no trouble. Glad I could help." Sophie hesitated, then took a deep breath as if making a decision. "You know," she said, voice quieter now, almost unsure, "I feel like I owe you more than just a thank you. You really saved me back there." Tom looked up at her, frowning slightly. She seemed distant in a way he couldn't quite explain. I'm just doing what anyone would. Her smile faltered just a little, the edges of it slipping into something else, something heavier. I don't think everyone would, but thank you. If you're ever in the city, let me know. Maybe I can return the favor. Sure thing, Tom said, chuckling lightly, though the offer felt out of place. What could a guy like him want from someone like her? Before he could say more, Sophie climbed into her car, the engine purring to life as she rolled down the window one last time. Her gaze met his, but there was a flicker of something unreadable there. Take care, Tom, she said, her voice soft, almost too careful. And with that, she drove off into the night, disappearing into the storm. Tom stood there for a moment, watching her taillights vanish in the rain, feeling a strange pull, a sense that something had shifted in the air. Something was left unsaid, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter, this simple act of helping a stranger, might have been the beginning of something he couldn't yet understand. Tom didn't think much about Sophie after that night. He had other things on his mind. Things like keeping his shop afloat and making sure his kids didn't grow up seeing him struggle more than they already did. Life moved on in the small town, and he went back to his usual rhythm, wrenching on cars, sipping his coffee from the chipped mug on his desk, and making sure the rent was paid. Sophie was just a fleeting moment, like so many others that passed by in the blink of an eye. But then the phone call came. It was a Friday afternoon, and Tom was tightening a bolt on an old pickup when his cell rang. He wiped his greasy hands on his overalls and glanced at the caller ID. The number looked unfamiliar, but something about it felt oddly out of place. Hello, he answered, trying to mask the weariness in his voice. Tom Heiress. A woman's voice, soft and warm, came through the line. It was familiar but not immediately recognizable. Yeah, this is Tom. It's Sophie. We met the other night. Her voice had a different tone now, less guarded, a little more confident. I hope I didn't catch you at a bad time. Tom paused, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. Sophie. He hadn't expected to hear from her again. Nah, no trouble. What's up? I've been thinking about what you did for me, helping me out that night, Sophie said. There was a brief pause, as if she was unsure how to continue. I want to return the favor. Tom chuckled softly, though it wasn't entirely from amusement. I'm sure you've already done enough. No need to go out of your way. I insist, she replied, a touch of sincerity in her voice. Actually, there's a charity event this weekend. My family's hosting it, and I'd really like for you to come as my guest. Tom felt his stomach drop a little. A charity event? His first thought was that this was some kind of joke, or maybe a mistake. Why on earth would someone like her want him, just a mechanic in a worn-out town, to attend some fancy event? I'm not really the gala type, Sophie, he said, trying to keep things light. She laughed softly on the other end of the line, her laughter clear and melodic. I can tell, but that's exactly why I want you there. You helped me when I needed it most. And honestly, I think you might be exactly the kind of person I need to talk to about some things. Tom hesitated, scratching the back of his neck. He could hear the sincerity in her voice, and part of him wanted to say yes, to go and see what this was all about. But the other part, his pride, mostly wanted to pull back. What was a guy like him supposed to do at a high society charity event? He wasn't exactly dressed for it, and his truck certainly wasn't. Listen, Sophie continued, sensing his hesitation. It's not about fitting in or anything like that. It's just a night out. I could really use someone who doesn't look at me like I'm just some rich girl. I want someone real, someone who doesn't care about all the money and the stuff. Please. The words hung in the air for a moment. There was something about the way she said someone real that made Tom pause. Maybe it was the vulnerability in her voice, or maybe it was the fact that, for once, someone wasn't treating him like a nobody. I'll think about it, Tom said finally, not wanting to commit, but not wanting to say no either. Sophie's voice brightened. Take your time, but please. I think you'll enjoy it. And hey, it could be fun. Tom chuckled again, this time a little more genuinely. Fun. Guess I'll have to trust you on that one. Good, Sophie said, her tone more playful now. I'll text you the details. See you this weekend. Tom felt a strange weight in his chest. It wasn't just the offer. No, it was the way Sophie had sounded, like she was genuinely reaching out to him for something more than just a mechanic. He wasn't sure what, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in a way he didn't understand yet. All right, he said, more to himself than to her. I'll be there. As he hung up, Tom leaned against the workbench, staring out the garage door at the rain still falling outside. He hadn't expected to hear from Sophie again, let alone be invited to something so far out of his world. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized there was something compelling about her. She was different. And maybe, just maybe, this night wasn't going to be as awkward as he thought. But even as he pondered it, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a simple invitation. There was more to Sophie than he'd seen, and maybe, just maybe, there was something bigger at play here, something he wasn't quite ready to understand. The weekend arrived faster than Tom expected. His truck was finally in decent shape after a week of repairs, but his mind kept drifting back to the charity event. The whole idea felt strange, like he was stepping into a world that didn't belong to him. Still, he had promised Sophie he'd show up, and he couldn't back out now. Not after everything. Saturday evening found him standing in front of his small bathroom mirror, adjusting his shirt for the umpteenth time. It wasn't much, just the button-up shirt he'd picked up on clearance a while back, and some dress pants that had seen better days. He felt out of place already. Sophie had been right about one thing. He wasn't exactly the gala type. The smell of engine grease and motor oil still clung to his skin, and his hands were rough from years of working with tools. Yet he couldn't help but feel a spark of curiosity about what kind of world Sophie lived in, what kind of life she led behind that polished smile. His wife, Claire, came up behind him, her eyes taking in his outfit. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing, only giving him a small smile. You sure about this? Tom shrugged, his face reflecting his uncertainty. I don't know. It feels weird, you know? Me at some fancy event. Don't even know if I'll fit in. Claire chuckled softly, reaching up to smooth a wrinkle on his shirt. Well, you're not exactly used to wearing anything but grease-stained overalls. But if you want to go, I say go. Maybe it'll be good for you, for all of us. He nodded, appreciating her support, though the anxiety still lingered. He had always felt like an outsider when it came to wealthier people, and this night was bound to bring that feeling to the surface again. But he owed it to Sophie to at least give it a shot. The drive to the event felt like an eternity. His truck rumbled along the slick streets, headlights cutting through the dark, wet roads. The further he went, the more his nerves started to spike. His hands gripped the wheel a little tighter, his mind racing with questions. What would the people there be like? Would he stand out like a sore thumb? What if he said the wrong thing? As he pulled up to the venue, the building came into view. An enormous mansion, its grand entrance lit with chandeliers that shone like golden beacons. Tom's heart skipped a beat. The contrast between the small town he knew and this world was impossible to ignore. His truck felt out of place in the sea of luxury cars parked outside. He parked and sat there for a moment, staring at the building, trying to gather himself. Finally, with a deep breath, he stepped out of the truck, smoothing down his shirt again. He could hear the faint sounds of laughter and music spilling from the mansion's open windows. His stomach turned, and his mind screamed at him to turn around, go home, and forget the whole thing. But he didn't. Sophie had asked him to come, and he couldn't back out. As he walked toward the entrance, he felt like an animal stepping into a cage. The doorman at the door gave him a polite, but curious glance before greeting him with a nod, a welcoming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Tom gave a nervous smile back, trying to seem confident even though his heart was pounding. Inside, the grand foyer was stunning, marble floors, tall columns, crystal chandeliers hanging above. People in elegant attire milled about, chatting in hushed voices, champagne glasses in hand. Tom felt out of place immediately, like he was wearing the wrong clothes for a party he hadn't been invited to. A woman in an expensive-looking gown approached him, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. She gave him a sharp, scrutinizing look, then smiled politely. "You must be Tom," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of politeness that was practiced rather than genuine. Sophie's told us so much about you. Tom's smile faltered for a moment. He wasn't sure how to respond to that. Who was us exactly? But he shook her hand, doing his best to remain composed. Yeah, that's me, he said, his voice awkward. Nice to meet you. The woman's smile didn't change. Enjoy the evening, she said with a slight nod, already moving past him. Tom glanced around, unsure of where to go. The crowd of guests seemed like they were all moving in slow motion, drifting from conversation to conversation, like they knew exactly where they belonged. And Tom? He felt like an imposter. As he wandered further into the room, a soft laugh caught his attention. He turned and saw Sophie, standing near the grand staircase, her face lighting up when she saw him. She wore a stunning red dress that made her look like she belonged in this world, not someone who had ever fixed a flat tire on a rainy street. But despite the elegance, there was something in her eyes, something familiar, almost like she had been waiting for him. Tom. Sophie greeted him with a warm smile, her voice carrying over the hum of the room. I'm so glad you came. Tom felt a rush of relief just seeing her. She was the one thing in this entire mansion that felt real. I didn't know what to expect, he admitted, taking a small step closer. This place is huge. Sophie laughed softly, her eyes glimmering with something more. Maybe humor, or maybe something deeper. Yeah, it's a bit much, huh? But I promise, it's not all like this. You'll see. The warmth of her smile calmed his nerves a little, and for the first time that night, Tom felt like maybe he could make it through the evening without embarrassing himself too badly. Sophie led him into the crowd, introducing him to a few people. But the entire time, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this night than just a simple charity event. Something about Sophie, her kindness, her invitation, felt like it was pulling him into a world that was too big for him to truly understand. He was still trying to shake off the unsettling feeling when Sophie leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. I'm really glad you came, Tom, she said, her eyes meeting his with a sincerity that sent a shiver down his spine. But there's something I need to tell you. His heart skipped a beat. What could she possibly have to say that made her so serious all of a sudden? Don't worry, she added quickly, her smile flickering just a little. It's just important. The ballroom hummed with laughter, the soft clink of champagne glasses, and the low murmur of conversation. Tom stood at the edge of the crowd, his palms slightly damp around his glass, the taste of expensive wine unfamiliar on his tongue. Sophie had disappeared into the crowd, swept away by the intricate dance of introductions and polite exchanges. He had half expected her to stay by his side, but she had vanished almost as quickly as she had found him, leaving him to navigate this world alone. Tom tried his best to blend in, offering tight smiles and nodding politely when people approached him, but he felt more like a deer caught in headlights than a guest at an elegant event. He didn't belong here. The women wore dresses that could have paid for a year's worth of groceries at his local store, and the men all had the kind of smooth talk that made him feel like he was speaking a language he didn't quite understand. Are you enjoying yourself? Tom turned at the voice, startled out of his thoughts. It was Sophie, her red dress glowing like a flame against the cool blues and silvers of the room. She had returned to him, her presence offering a kind of comfort that he didn't realize he needed. I'm surviving, Tom said with a half-hearted laugh, his gaze flickering around the room as if he might find an escape. This is a whole other world, isn't it? Sophie chuckled, the sound light but edged with something else, something that hinted she didn't feel like she belonged here either, despite everything. It is, she admitted, her eyes scanning the crowd. Sometimes I wonder why I even come to these things. Why do you? Tom asked, genuinely curious. It didn't seem like the kind of event she would enjoy, at least, not from what he'd seen of her so far. Sophie hesitated for a moment, and when she met his eyes again, there was a flicker of vulnerability that made Tom's chest tighten. Because I have to, she said simply. People expect me to. There it was, the first crack in the facade. Tom had always known there was something different about Sophie. Her easy smiles, the way she floated through the room, how effortlessly she seemed to command attention. Yet now, hearing her words, it felt like he was seeing her for the first time. I don't think you have to, Tom said quietly, before he could stop himself. I think you could do whatever you wanted. Sophie looked at him for a long moment, her lips parting slightly as if she was about to say something more. But before she could, a man in a tuxedo approached, interrupting their moment. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that was slicked back with far too much gel. He was the kind of man who seemed perfectly at home in a place like this, radiating wealth and self-assurance. "Ah, Sophie," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "There you are. We were wondering where you went off to." Sophie gave a polite smile, but didn't move toward him. "Just catching up with my guest here," she said, glancing briefly at Tom. Tom gave a tight nod, but the man didn't seem to care about him much. Instead, his gaze fixed on Sophie, his tone shifting ever so slightly, almost like he was testing her. "You know, you've been a little distant tonight. People are starting to talk." He smiled as if the words were nothing more than a game, but there was something underneath that Tom didn't like. Sophie's smile tightened, the warmth disappearing from her eyes. "I'm fine, Derek," she said, her voice clipped. "Just tired, I guess." Derek raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Instead, he glanced at Tom, his expression suddenly polite, if not slightly dismissive. "It's nice to meet you, Tom," he said with a barely there nod before turning back to Sophie. "We'll catch up later, all right?" Sophie didn't respond immediately. As Derek walked away, she stood still for a beat, her eyes hardening, her posture stiff. Tom watched her carefully, wondering what was going on beneath the surface. "Who was that?" Tom asked, his voice low, though he couldn't hide the curiosity in his tone. Something about the interaction didn't sit right with him. There was an edge in Sophie's voice that he hadn't heard before, and he didn't like the way Derek seemed to control the conversation without even trying. Sophie took a breath, her shoulders sagging just slightly. "That was Derek. He's a family friend," she said, but her voice lacked the usual warmth she'd used with him. "He's one of the reasons I come to these things. My family insists." There it was again, the pressure, the weight of expectations that Sophie was trying so hard to bear, even if it was breaking her apart at the seams. Tom stepped a little closer, his concern evident now. "He doesn't seem like the kind of guy you need in your life." Sophie's gaze flickered to him, and for a moment, he could see the strain in her eyes. "He's just part of the world I'm stuck in. It's complicated." Tom wasn't sure what she meant by that, but he didn't push her any further. Instead, he gave a small, reassuring smile, hoping to break the tension. "Well, if you ever need someone to pull you out of here, just say the word," he said lightly, trying to offer some comfort, even though he wasn't sure how much it would help. Sophie's expression softened slightly, the tension easing from her shoulders as she returned his smile. "I just might take you up on that," she said quietly. But even as she smiled, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie was hiding something deeper than the pretenses of this high society world. She had been honest with him before, but there was something about her that was still out of reach, something she wasn't ready to share. And for some reason, that made Tom feel more uneasy than all the glittering chandeliers and fancy clothes in the room. As Sophie glanced back at Derek, Tom watched her carefully, sensing that the night was far from over, and that whatever she wasn't saying would change everything. The night dragged on, the endless chatter and laughter echoing off the grand marble floors. Tom, despite his best efforts, couldn't shake the feeling of being an intruder in this world, one that seemed so polished and rehearsed. The conversations felt scripted, the smiles too perfect. Even Sophie, who had been so warm when they first met, was slipping into the role of the untouchable heiress again, her laughter too practiced, her responses a little too quick. He had tried to make the best of it, mingling with a few people who had nodded politely when introduced. But he kept finding himself on the edge of conversations, caught between awkward silences and fake smiles. And every time his eyes flickered towards Sophie, she seemed further and further out of reach, surrounded by people who didn't seem to see her the way he did. It was almost as if she had two faces, one for the world and one for him. Tom's gaze kept drifting back to her across the room. She was laughing at something Derek had said, her head tilted slightly, eyes sparkling, the image of someone who belonged in this world. Yet as he watched, something in Sophie's eyes didn't match the smile. There was a flicker of something darker, something more fragile, just beneath the surface. "Are you okay, Tom?" The voice broke his thoughts, and Tom turned to find Sophie standing beside him. She had slipped away from the crowd unnoticed, her red dress catching the light as she stepped into his space. Her face was softer now, more tired, as if the night had worn on her too. There was something about her that made Tom want to reach out and pull her from this world, to protect her from whatever she was hiding. "Yeah, I'm all right," he said, giving her a small smile. "Just not used to all this." Sophie returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I can tell, but I'm glad you came." "Really?" Her words didn't ease his tension. If anything, they made him feel more anxious. Something had shifted between them. She wasn't the carefree, confident woman he'd met that rainy night. Tonight, she seemed like she was wearing a mask that even she was starting to struggle with. "Are you having fun?" he asked, unsure of how to phrase the question. The question felt empty as soon as he said it. Sophie wasn't having fun, that much was clear. She hesitated before answering, her eyes scanning the room behind her as if searching for something or someone. "Not really," she said quietly, her voice lower than before. "I don't belong here, Tom. Sometimes, I feel like I'm just playing a part." Her words caught him off guard. She had always seemed so in control, so sure of herself. But now, standing before him, there was a vulnerability in her that made his chest tighten. He could see the cracks now, the way she was breaking beneath the weight of this world she was forced to live in. "I get it," he said softly, his voice steady but laced with a quiet understanding. "You're not the only one who feels out of place. But you don't have to do this alone, you know. If you want, I could help." Sophie met his gaze, and for a moment, he saw something flicker, something deeper than the party, deeper than the money and the status. It was raw and unguarded, and it made his heart race. But before she could respond, Derek appeared once again, his imposing figure cutting through the crowd. He was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, the kind that Tom had come to associate with people who were used to getting their way. "There you are," Derek said smoothly, addressing Sophie with a possessiveness that made Tom bristle. "I was looking for you." Sophie quickly stood up straighter, smoothing her dress down, a smile replacing the tension in her posture. "I was just checking in with Tom. He's been a great help tonight." Derek's eyes shifted to Tom, narrowing for a fraction of a second before he turned back to Sophie. "Well, I'm sure he's having a good time with all the people here," he said, his tone dismissive, as if Tom were a passing stranger rather than someone who had done Sophie a favor. Tom didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. He could see the way Derek looked at Sophie, like she was something to be possessed, a pawn to be played in some game he didn't fully understand. But what caught Tom's attention was the way Sophie's smile faltered at the mention of good time. It was only for a brief moment, but Tom noticed it. Sophie's eyes flickered to Tom, a brief but heavy exchange between them before Derek spoke again. "Let's get some air," Derek suggested, already turning to lead Sophie away. He barely glanced at Tom. Sophie's feet shifted slightly, a hint of hesitation in the way she stood before finally nodding. "Sure." Tom watched them leave, the tension in his chest growing as he stood there, rooted to the spot. Something wasn't right. He didn't know what it was, but he felt it, the pressure building behind Sophie's eyes, the forced smile, the tension every time Derek came around. There was a storm behind those masks, and Tom was beginning to realize that Sophie wasn't just out of place in this world. She was trapped in it. And the more he saw, the more he felt like he was standing on the edge of something dark, something he wasn't prepared for. As they walked away, Sophie cast one last glance back at him, the briefest flicker of something desperate in her gaze. Then, just like that, she was gone, swept away by the tide of wealth and expectation that seemed to be swallowing her whole. Tom's stomach churned. He hadn't come here to be part of some high society game. But if Sophie was truly caught in it, he wasn't about to stand by and watch it break her. The night dragged on, but Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Sophie had disappeared into the crowd, and Derek had practically dragged her off somewhere private. Tom was left alone again, surrounded by people who spoke in soft voices, their words blending together like the background noise of a world he would never belong to. He tried to busy himself by pretending to enjoy the hors d'oeuvres and the never-ending stream of polite conversation, but his mind kept drifting back to Sophie. Every time he thought about her, he saw that flicker of unease in her eyes, the way she looked at him just before Derek had pulled her away. She was trapped, caught in something she couldn't escape, and Tom didn't know if he could help her or if she even wanted him to. His thoughts were interrupted when he heard someone approaching behind him. The voice was familiar, but when he turned, it wasn't Sophie. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, his presence commanding. He was wearing a suit that likely cost more than Tom's entire truck. This man had the kind of face that said he was used to getting what he wanted and expecting respect with it. Tom Heiress, right? The man's voice was deep, smooth, with just the slightest hint of arrogance. I'm James Montgomery, Sophie's father. Tom's stomach tightened. He had heard of James Montgomery, of course. He was a powerful businessman, one of the wealthiest men in the region. But he hadn't expected to meet him in person, or for the meeting to feel so intense. Yeah, that's me, Tom replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He offered his hand, but James looked at it briefly before shaking it with a firm grip that made Tom feel small. You've been spending a lot of time with my daughter, James said, his tone even, but his eyes calculating. I don't know what you think this is, but let me make something clear. Tom's heart began to pound in his chest, but he stood his ground. I'm not sure I follow, he said, keeping his voice level. James took a slow step forward, his gaze narrowing slightly. Sophie isn't some charity case, Tom. She doesn't need your help or your pity. She has a responsibility, a family legacy to uphold. Do you understand that? Tom felt a chill run down his spine. He had no idea what James was really after, but it didn't take a genius to figure out that this wasn't just a friendly conversation. The tension in the air thickened, and Tom's instincts told him he was standing on shaky ground. I didn't ask for any of this, Tom said, his voice firm despite the unease building inside him. I'm just here because she needed help and I offered it. That's all. James stared at him for a long moment, his lips curling into a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. Don't mistake kindness for weakness, Tom. People like us don't get where we are by being kind. We get there by making sure the right people are in the right places. Tom's stomach churned as the meaning of James's words began to sink in. This wasn't about charity or help or even Sophie's well-being. This was about control. This was about keeping Sophie in line, making sure she didn't stray from the path that James and his family had set for her. And what exactly does that have to do with me? Tom asked, though he was already afraid he knew the answer. James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied Tom for a moment, then glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the crowd. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more measured. You're a distraction, Tom. I'm sure Sophie enjoys the company, but that's all this is. You're not part of her world, and she's not part of yours. The sooner you both realize that, the better for everyone. Tom stood there, his pulse pounding in his ears. It felt like the air had grown heavier, like the world around him was closing in. James Montgomery's words weren't just a warning, they were a threat. Sophie was caught in the middle of a life that wasn't hers to control, and Tom realized, with a sickening feeling, that he had walked right into a trap. Stay away from her, Tom, James said finally, his voice low but insistent. She has a place, a future, that you can't give her. You do well to remember that. With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Tom standing there, stunned and reeling. His chest felt tight, the weight of James's words pressing down on him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He didn't belong here, and Sophie didn't either, not in the way James envisioned for her. Tom's gaze drifted toward the balcony, where he saw Sophie standing alone, her posture stiff and distant. He could feel the invisible barrier between them, the one that had been there all night, growing thicker with every passing moment. But now, it was something more than just a simple difference in social circles. It was a wall, built by people like James who had no intention of letting someone like Tom, someone like them, into their world. Tom took a deep breath, his mind racing. He couldn't leave her like this. He wouldn't. But he also knew that whatever he did next, it wouldn't be easy. Not by a long shot. He had to make a choice about whether to walk away or to step into a world that wasn't his own and risk everything in the process. Sophie was in trouble, and Tom knew, deep down, that helping her might cost him more than he was prepared to pay. As he made his way toward her, he could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She knew it too. Tom didn't need to look back. He could feel the weight of James Montgomery's words still hanging in the air, suffocating him with their finality. The space between him and Sophie felt wider now, more imposing. And yet, as he stood there in the lavish ballroom, the choice before him was no longer about fitting in. It was about something deeper, something he couldn't ignore, no matter how hard he tried. He made his way through the crowd, his heart pounding, ignoring the polite exchanges and the sidelong glances. He could see Sophie at the far end of the room, her figure standing near the balcony, looking out over the city that stretched beyond the mansion's walls. It was strange, really, how small she looked, standing there by herself, surrounded by all this wealth and luxury. For all the opulence, it was the loneliness in her that made Tom's chest ache. Sophie turned as she heard his footsteps, her eyes locking onto his, but she didn't smile. She looked weary, her shoulders slightly hunched, as if she had been carrying something heavy for a long time. Tom stopped a few feet away from her, not sure what to say at first. He could feel the walls closing in again, the ones built by her family, by James. But he also knew something deeper now. Sophie wasn't just caught in a web of expectations, she was trapped by her own sense of duty, by a life that demanded she wear a mask of perfection. "I talked to your dad," Tom said quietly, his voice raw but steady. "He told me to stay away from you." Sophie's eyes darkened and she quickly turned away, staring out at the city lights. The silence between them felt like an unspoken truth, something both of them had been avoiding but couldn't ignore anymore. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted this for you. For you to be pulled into this mess." Tom stepped closer, his hand reaching out but hesitating just before it touched her arm. "Sophie, I'm not the one who asked for this. You didn't ask for any of this, did you?" Her eyes flickered back to him, and there was a flicker of something, anger, hurt, maybe both behind her gaze. "No, I didn't," she said, her voice breaking on the last word. "But I can't walk away from it. I have a responsibility, Tom. You wouldn't understand." Tom's heart ached at the words, the weight of her responsibility pressing down on her shoulders like 1,000 pounds. He understood more than she thought. He understood what it felt like to be trapped, to feel like every decision you made was dictated by someone else's expectations. It was suffocating, and Sophie was suffocating too, under the weight of a life that wasn't hers to control. "Sophie," he said softly, stepping in front of her, forcing her to look at him. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to be what everyone else expects you to be. You deserve more than this, more than being trapped in a life that doesn't fit you." Her eyes welled up with tears, and for the first time that night, she let them fall. The perfect mask cracked, and Sophie Montgomery, the heiress to a fortune, was just a woman, someone who felt just as lost and powerless as anyone else. "I don't know how to get out of it," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't know how to get away from them. From him." She swallowed hard, her gaze flickering toward the door where her father and Derek stood talking in the distance. "They control everything. My life, my choices. Even you. They don't want me around people like you. People who don't have a place in their world." Tom's chest tightened as he realized just how deep the pain went. Sophie was caught in a battle she couldn't win, fighting against people who had shaped her life for her, without ever asking her what she wanted. "You don't have to fight alone, Sophie," Tom said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll help you, whatever it takes. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to live this life if it isn't yours." She shook her head, her tears now flowing freely. "I can't just leave everything behind. My family, my name. It's not that easy." Tom reached out, gently taking her hands in his. "You don't have to leave everything behind, but you can choose a different way forward. A way that's yours. You can choose who you want to be, Sophie, and I'll be there with you." Sophie looked at him, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. For a moment, she seemed to hesitate, as though considering all the consequences of what he was offering. And for a moment, the weight of her family's expectations seemed to lift, just enough for her to breathe. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, she spoke the words that Tom had been waiting to hear. I want to leave, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. I want to go somewhere else. Somewhere I can breathe. Somewhere I can be myself. Tom's heart soared with the relief he hadn't known he needed. The weight that had settled on his chest for so long was gone. They still had a long way to go. But for the first time, Sophie had made the choice to step away from the life she had been handed, to take control of her future. Then we'll figure it out, Tom said, his grip tightening around her hands, offering her everything he had. We'll figure it out together. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with an uncertain hope. Do you really think we can do this? She asked, her voice still fragile. I know we can, Tom replied, a quiet confidence in his voice. I've got you, and you've got me. The noise of the party, the distant clinking of glasses, faded away as they stood there together, holding on to something that had nothing to do with wealth or expectations. It was just them, two people with a shared future to build, far away from the walls that had once kept them trapped. And for the first time that night, the weight of the world seemed just a little bit lighter.